A private jet worth tens of millions of dollars sat dead on the runway after 3 years of failed repairs. When every expert in the industry had given up, a single father named Gabriel Carter was hired as a last resort. In just 10 days, he did what no one else could do. But the moment the jet roared back to life, the company's leadership tried to cheat him out of the payment they had promised. Gabriel said nothing. He simply walked away. 2 days later, the same jet died again, right in front of the richest investors in America. Stay until the very end to discover why only one quiet man could wake up a $40 million jet. Gabriel Carter lived a quiet life in a small town where nobody asked questions about his past, and that suited him fine. He had once been one of the finest aerospace engineers the military had ever trained, a man who understood machines the way other men understood their own heartbeat. After his wife passed away, something in him closed like a door that refused to open again, and he walked away from a career that could have made him famous. He spent his days fixing tractors, generators, and the occasional small aircraft engine for farmers who paid him in cash and gratitude. His son was the only thing that still made sense to him, and he built his whole life around getting that boy to school on time and putting dinner on the table. In the circles where engineers still whispered legends, his name had faded into something close to myth, remembered by a few, doubted by many, and forgotten by most. He kept a single drawer in his workshop filled with old certifications and faded photographs from a career that felt, most days, like it belonged to a different person entirely. His neighbors knew him only as the quiet man who could fix anything with an engine, never suspecting the depth of what he had once been capable of designing. His son, still young enough to think every father spent his evenings covered in grease, never once questioned why other families seemed to have more, because Gabriel made sure he never felt the absence of it. There was a discipline to the smallness of his life, a deliberate choice to stay invisible after losing the one person who had once made visibility feel safe. Across the country, Harrison Aerospace was unraveling in full public view. Their flagship prototype, a private jet meant to redefine luxury air travel, had failed test after test for 3 straight years. Charlotte Harrison, the company's chief executive, felt the weight of every investor phone call landing on her shoulders like a physical blow, and some nights she stayed alone in her office long after the building had emptied, staring at projections that refused to improve no matter how many times she rearranged them. Her chief operating officer, Ryan Mitchell, pushed harder every week, desperate to force the jet into a public demonstration regardless of the risk, treating every setback as someone else's failure rather than a problem the whole team needed to solve together. Hundreds of engineers had rotated through the project, each one leaving more confused than the last. The company's reputation and Charlotte's career were balanced on the edge of a runway that refused to let anything take off. The aircraft at the center of the crisis carried a name that had started to feel like a curse inside the company. Falcon X had consumed more than $60 million in research, testing, and redesigns, and it still could not be trusted to start twice in a row. The engines would fire, hum with promise for a few seconds, and then shut down without warning, leaving engineers staring at screens full of numbers that told them nothing useful. Specialists from 3 different manufacturers had examined the aircraft, each presenting a new theory, and each theory eventually collapsing under its own weight. Reporters had started writing about Falcon X as a symbol of corporate excess and engineering failure, and every headline cut a little deeper into Charlotte's resolve. Major investors, including a soft-spoken but formidable man named Aaron Foster, began openly discussing the possibility of pulling their money out entirely. Within the engineering division, morale had collapsed almost as thoroughly as the aircraft's reliability, with several senior staff quietly updating their resumes in anticipation of layoffs they assumed were coming. Charlotte spent her nights reading projection models that all pointed toward the same grim conclusion, that the company could not absorb another failed demonstration without losing its remaining credibility entirely. Ryan, meanwhile, treated every crisis meeting as an opportunity to position himself as the only person in the building still thinking clearly, even as his own suggestions grew increasingly reckless. He pushed for a public demonstration before the underlying flaw was even understood, arguing that confidence alone might be enough to calm the markets, a strategy that quietly horrified the few engineers brave enough to question it aloud. Inside a tense boardroom, Ryan finally suggested something nobody wanted to hear, which was bringing in one outside expert as a final attempt before the entire project was shut down for good. Jessica Brooks, the head of the technical team, spoke up with a name that made several people in the room raise their eyebrows. She mentioned Gabriel Carter, A man some of the older engineers vaguely remembered from years earlier, a man with no corporate affiliation and no flashy credentials displayed anywhere online. Ryan laughed at the suggestion, calling it a desperate grasp at a ghost story, and several junior staff members snickered along with him. Charlotte, exhausted and out of options, overruled the laughter and agreed to one meeting, telling herself it could not possibly make things worse than they already were. Jessica left that meeting with a phone number scribbled on a torn piece of paper and a strange, stubborn hope she could not quite explain. Gabriel arrived at Harrison Aerospace driving an old, dented pickup truck that had clearly seen better decades, parking it awkwardly between two luxury vehicles that probably cost more than his entire neighborhood. The security guard at the gate assumed he was a delivery driver and almost sent him around to the loading dock before Jessica rushed out to intercept the mistake. Ryan made no effort to hide his disdain, greeting Gabriel with a smirk and a remark about hoping he had brought his own tools, since the company certainly was not paying for amateur hour. A cluster of young engineers exchanged amused glances, clearly expecting this stranger to last about 20 minutes before admitting defeat. Gabriel said almost nothing in response, simply nodding and asking to be taken directly to the aircraft instead of to another conference room full of slideshows. He had heard variations of that same condescending tone for most of his career, back when uniforms and rank had at least forced people to pretend at respect, and he had long since stopped letting it cost him any energy. The young engineers trailing behind Ryan exchanged glances that suggested they had already decided how this story would end, certain that confidence and credentials mattered more than whatever quiet instincts this stranger claimed to have. Jessica, walking a half step behind the group, found herself unexpectedly curious about a man who seemed entirely unbothered by being underestimated. When he reached Falcon X, Gabriel walked around the fuselage slowly, running his hand along the metal the way someone might greet an old friend they had not seen in years. He refused the binder of technical reports that someone tried to hand him, explaining quietly that paper rarely told the truth about a machine the way the machine itself did. For hours he simply observed, listening to test runs, watching gauges and occasionally crouching beneath the engine housing with a small flashlight clenched between his teeth. The other engineers grew restless, certain they were watching an old man waste an afternoon on theatrics rather than actual diagnostics. Then, almost as an afterthought, Gabriel pointed to a single wiring junction near the rear sensor array and asked when it had last been modified, a question nobody in the room could immediately answer. Jessica felt something shift inside her chest, a flicker of recognition that this man might be seeing something the rest of them had walked past 1,000 times without noticing. By the end of that first day, Gabriel agreed to take on the project under one condition, which he insisted be put in writing before he touched another bolt. If he successfully repaired Falcon X, the company would pay him $500,000. A figure Ryan scoffed at, but Charlotte ultimately approved out of sheer desperation. The contract was signed, dated, and filed, with Charlotte's own signature directly beneath Gabriel's steady handwriting. Ryan watched the signing with thinly veiled contempt, already privately convinced this stranger would fail just like everyone before him. He made a quiet remark to a colleague afterward, predicting that Gabriel would last perhaps a week before quietly disappearing with an excuse about scheduling conflicts. Gabriel folded his copy of the contract, slid it into his jacket pocket, and walked back toward the hangar without another word, already thinking about wiring diagrams instead of money. Over the following days, Gabriel dismantled portions of the aircraft that previous teams had never bothered to touch, ignoring the standard diagnostic checklist that every other engineer had followed religiously. He worked alone for long stretches, occasionally asking Jessica pointed questions that revealed he was thinking several steps ahead of everyone else in the building. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that the failure had nothing to do with the engine itself, despite years of attention focused there. Instead, he traced the problem to a chain of sensors that had been miscalibrated against each other during an early design revision, each one compensating for the other's errors in a way that masked the true issue. A single, almost invisible adjustment made years earlier had quietly rippled through every system downstream, creating a cascade of false readings that no one had ever connected back to its source. Hundreds of engineers before him had treated the symptoms one at a time, chasing whichever warning light flashed loudest, never stepping back far enough to see the larger pattern. Gabriel spent an entire night tracing that single design revision backward through years of maintenance logs, cross-referencing dates against test failures that everyone else had assumed were unrelated incidents. What he found unsettled even him, a quiet confirmation that the very same flaw had been visible in the data for years, hiding in plain sight because no one had ever been willing to question the original design itself. He sketched the entire sensor relationship by hand on a whiteboard, refusing to rely on the company's own diagrams, which he suspected had inherited the same blind spot that caused the problem in the first place. Jessica stood beside him as he worked, watching connections emerge that she had spent 3 years failing to see, and feeling something close to embarrassment mixed with genuine awe. She began keeping her own notes that night, telling herself quietly that whatever happened with this contract, she would never again let a problem this important rest entirely on one overworked outsider's shoulders alone. Ryan grew increasingly impatient as the days passed without a dramatic announcement, convinced Gabriel was simply stalling to justify a paycheck the company could not really afford. He complained to Charlotte daily, insisting they cut their losses and find someone more conventional before the investors lost what little patience remained. Charlotte, however, found herself quietly impressed by Gabriel's calm precision, even as the pressure from her board grew heavier with each passing hour. Jessica became Gabriel's most vocal defender in every meeting, explaining to skeptical executives that what looked like inaction was actually the most thorough diagnostic the aircraft had ever received. When Gabriel finally requested 72 more hours to complete a critical phase of the repair, Ryan exploded in frustration, but Charlotte, against her own instincts toward caution, granted the extension anyway. The investors delivered an ultimatum that arrived like a verdict rather than a request, stating plainly that if Falcon X failed one more public demonstration, the entire project would be terminated immediately. Gabriel worked through the nights that followed, fueled by little more than black coffee and a stubborn refusal to leave anything unfinished. Nobody else in the building, including Jessica, knew exactly what he was doing at any given moment, since he had stopped explaining each step in detail. Behind closed doors, Ryan quietly assembled a file of memos and emails designed to shift blame onto Gabriel should the repair ultimately fail, protecting himself regardless of the outcome. Charlotte barely slept those final nights, pacing her office and rehearsing apologies to a board of investors she was not yet sure she would need to give. On the last evening before the deadline, Gabriel finally stepped back from the open engine bay, wiped his hands on a rag, and told Jessica simply that it was time to test it in the morning and that the entire company would be waiting to see if he was right. He did not sleep that night, choosing instead to sit alone in the empty hangar, running through every connection in his mind one final time, the way he used to check his work before sending soldiers up in aircraft that could not afford a single mistake. Somewhere across town, his son was asleep at a neighbor's house, unaware that his father's quiet, ordinary life was about to collide with cameras, headlines, and a boardroom full of people who had underestimated him from the very first handshake. Charlotte, too, found herself unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of her office and wondering whether she had just gambled the last of her company's credibility on a man nobody else had believed in. When morning arrived, the lead test pilot, Connor Blake, climbed into the cockpit with the same guarded skepticism he had carried through every failed attempt over the past 3 years. He ran through the startup sequence slowly, half expecting the familiar shudder and silence that had haunted this aircraft for so long. Instead, the engines caught cleanly and held steady, settling into a smooth, confident hum that filled the hangar like something almost alive. The instrument panel lit up with numbers that exceeded every benchmark the engineering team had set, and Connor's hands tightened on the controls not from fear but from disbelief. Falcon X taxied onto the runway, accelerated without hesitation, and lifted into the sky in a takeoff so clean that several engineers on the ground later admitted they had stopped breathing entirely. Inside the control room, decades of frustration broke apart all at once into shouting, applause, and at least one engineer openly weeping into his coffee. Charlotte stood at the window watching the jet climb, feeling something loosen in her chest that she realized had been tight for years. News crews who had once mocked the company's repeated failures now scrambled to cover its sudden, stunning success. Aaron Foster called Charlotte within the hour, his earlier threats of withdrawal replaced by enthusiastic talk of expanding his investment instead. The company's valuation surged overnight, erasing months of negative headlines in a single triumphant flight. Through all of it, Gabriel stood quietly near the hangar doors, arms crossed, watching the jet circle back toward the runway with the satisfied expression of a man who had simply finished a job he set out to do. Jessica caught his eye across the crowded hangar and offered a small nod of gratitude, which he returned with nothing more than the faintest hint of a smile. Connor, once skeptical of everything about this stranger, found himself shaking Gabriel's hand on the tarmac, admitting that he had never felt an aircraft handle so smoothly in his entire career. He had no interest in the cameras gathering nearby, and he slipped away before anyone thought to ask him for a statement. In the days that followed, Gabriel submitted his final report, documented every change he had made, and waited for the payment that had been promised to him in writing. Instead of a check, he received a summons to a closed-door meeting that included Ryan, 2 company lawyers, and notably, no invitation for Jessica to attend. Ryan opened the meeting by announcing, with a tight, practiced smile, that the credit for the repair belonged to the in-house engineering team, and that Gabriel's role had merely been consultative in nature. He suggested, almost as an afterthought, that perhaps a token payment would be more appropriate than the figure originally agreed upon. The legal department had already begun searching for language that might quietly invalidate portions of the contract, citing vague clauses about scope and deliverables that nobody had mentioned before. Charlotte, worn down by board pressure and persuaded by Ryan's relentless framing, allowed herself to believe that paying the full amount might not be necessary after all. When the paperwork arrived offering Gabriel a small fraction of what he had been promised, he read it once, set it down on the table, and said nothing for a long moment. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten legal action, and did not argue the point even once, which somehow unsettled the lawyers more than an outburst would have. He simply stood, gathered the small toolbox he had brought from home, and walked out of the building without signing a single page they placed in front of him. Jessica found out about the meeting only afterward, and the anger that rose in her surprised even herself, though she said nothing to Ryan directly. Gabriel drove home that evening the same way he had arrived, in his old pickup truck, saying very little to his son beyond the fact that the job was finished. He sat at his kitchen table that night with the unsigned papers still folded in his jacket pocket, thinking less about the money he had lost, and more about how easily people in expensive suits could rewrite the truth once it became inconvenient for them. He thought, too, about the engineers he had spent days centering, wondering whether any of them would remember what he had actually taught them once the cameras and applause faded away. There was no satisfaction in being right about how the meeting would end, only a familiar, tired confirmation of something he had learned long before he ever set foot in that hangar. The company, for its part, considered the matter closed, certain that a quiet exit meant a problem that had simply gone away. 2 days later, Harrison Aerospace prepared for a public demonstration meant to cement Falcon X's comeback in front of its most important investors. Ryan stood near the podium beaming with confidence, telling reporters and shareholders alike that the project's success belonged entirely to the dedication of his internal team. Connor climbed into the cockpit once more, ran through the same startup sequence that had worked flawlessly just days earlier, and waited for the familiar reassuring hum of the engines. Instead, there was nothing but silence, followed by a string of error messages flashing red across every screen in the cockpit. Engineers rushed the runway, checking connections, restarting systems, and trying every fix they could remember, but the aircraft refused to respond to any of it. Ryan's confident expression dissolved into something closer to panic as the silence stretched on in front of cameras that were very much still rolling. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, Jessica felt a cold, creeping suspicion settle over her, a feeling that whatever had gone wrong was not random at all, but the direct result of someone tampering with a system they never truly understood. The investors who had gathered to celebrate a triumph instead witnessed a complete and humiliating collapse, murmuring among themselves as the minutes ticked past without explanation. Reporters who had been preparing celebratory headlines hours earlier now scrambled to capture footage of the unraveling crisis instead. By the time markets opened the next morning, news of the failed demonstration had already sent the company's stock price tumbling sharply downward. Aaron Foster demanded answers directly from Charlotte, his patience from days earlier replaced by a cold, pointed skepticism that cut through every excuse offered to him. Ryan, cornered by furious investors, began blaming the engineering team, the manufacturing partners, and eventually even the weather, anything that might deflect attention from himself. Engineers worked desperately through the night trying to reverse whatever had changed, but each attempted fix seemed to make the system more unstable rather than less. Somewhere in the chaos, a junior technician quietly admitted to a colleague that he had made a few adjustments at Ryan's request shortly after Gabriel left, though he kept that detail far from anyone in a position of authority. The hangar, once filled with celebration, now felt like a hospital waiting room, full of frightened people pretending they understood far more than they did. Reporters camped outside the gates filed updates every hour, each one more damaging than the last, transforming what should have been a triumph into a very public unraveling. Charlotte fielded calls from board members demanding immediate answers she did not have, each conversation chipping away at whatever confidence remained in her leadership. Charlotte, increasingly desperate, ordered her staff to find Gabriel immediately and bring him back regardless of cost or pride. Calls to his phone went unanswered, and messages left with mutual contacts produced no response of any kind. He had quietly stepped back from every line of contact that might reach him, disappearing as completely and deliberately as he had once disappeared from the engineering world years earlier. Jessica watched the chaos unfold around her with a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with the falling stock price. She began to suspect, quietly at first and then with increasing certainty, that nobody at the company actually understood what Gabriel had done to fix the aircraft in the first place. If that was true, she realized, then whatever had broken it again might be something only he could undo. Refusing to wait for official channels to produce results, Jessica took matters into her own hands and began tracing whatever scraps of information she could find about Gabriel's whereabouts. An old colleague eventually pointed her toward a small town a few hours away, home to a modest workshop attached to a house with a basketball hoop bolted above the garage door. She found Gabriel exactly where the description suggested, elbow deep in the engine of someone's aging sedan, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos he had left behind at Harrison Aerospace. The workshop smelled of motor oil and cut grass, and a half-finished bicycle leaned against the far wall, clearly a project being slowly assembled for his son's upcoming birthday. Jessica stood awkwardly near the doorway for a moment, suddenly aware of how strange it felt to track down a man who had simply wanted to be left alone after being treated so unfairly. When she explained what had happened during the demonstration, his expression remained calm, almost unsurprised, as though he had been quietly expecting this outcome all along. He told her plainly that he had not sabotaged anything, and that the failure she was describing had a far simpler explanation than anyone back at the company seemed willing to consider. Jessica pressed him for details, sensing that whatever he knew might finally make sense of days that had otherwise felt completely senseless. Gabriel explained that after he had been denied his promised payment, Ryan had grown anxious to claim sole credit for the repair before the next major showcase. In an effort to make the fix appear entirely the work of internal staff, Ryan had quietly authorized small adjustments to several calibration settings that Gabriel had originally configured with extreme precision. Those settings had been deliberately interconnected, balanced against one another in a way that allowed the entire system to function as a coordinated whole rather than a collection of separate parts. Altering even one value without understanding the full relationship between them was enough to throw the entire balance into chaos, exactly the kind of cascading failure that had plagued the aircraft for years. Gabriel had warned, in his original documentation, that nothing in the system should be modified without his direct involvement, a warning Ryan had apparently dismissed as unnecessary caution from an outside contractor. He had not lifted a finger to cause the failure himself. Yet he had known, the moment he learned of the unauthorized changes, exactly what the result would eventually be. He told Jessica, almost gently, that he had spent years building things meant to keep people safe, and that watching someone treat that kind of precision so carelessly, purely to claim credit, was the part that bothered him most. It was not anger that kept him away, he explained, but a quiet refusal to keep rescuing people who had no intention of valuing the work once it was done. Jessica realized, listening to him speak, that this was never really about the $500,000 at all, but about a lifetime of being overlooked by people who mistook humility for weakness. Jessica sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the full shape of what had happened settle over her like a held breath finally released. She told Gabriel that the engineers back at the company were innocent in all of this, working desperately through sleepless nights to fix a problem they had never created. Gabriel acknowledged that much was true, admitting he felt for the young engineers caught in the middle of a mess born from someone else's greed and carelessness. Still, he refused to simply return and quietly fix things again, explaining that doing so would only let the people responsible escape consequences once more, exactly as they had after his first contract was ignored. He told Jessica that he would consider coming back only if the company was willing to acknowledge, openly and honestly, exactly what had happened and why. Jessica nodded slowly, already turning over in her mind how she might convince a boardroom full of frightened executives to finally tell the truth. Back at Harrison Aerospace, Jessica requested an emergency meeting with Charlotte and presented everything she had uncovered, including internal emails she had managed to retrieve from the company's own servers. The messages showed Ryan instructing a junior technician to adjust specific calibration values shortly after Gabriel's departure, explicitly framing the request as a way to demonstrate independent competence before the investor demonstration. Charlotte read through the exchanges in silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to a quiet, simmering anger directed squarely at the man she had trusted to manage daily operations. Aaron Foster, invited into the meeting once the evidence became clear, did not bother hiding his fury, demanding immediate accountability from everyone seated at the table. The board convened an emergency session that same afternoon, voting unanimously to open a formal investigation into Ryan's conduct throughout the entire Falcon X project. Lawyers who had once worked to find loopholes in Gabriel's contract now combed through Ryan's correspondence instead, building a timeline that left little room for denial. Several engineers who had quietly suspected something was wrong after the failed demonstration came forward voluntarily, eager to clear their own names once they understood the truth. Charlotte, facing her own reflection in the glass walls of the conference room, admitted quietly to Jessica that she had let pressure and convenience cloud judgment she should have trusted from the very beginning. She thought back to the moment she had signed Gabriel's original contract, remembering how certain she had felt about the fairness of that agreement before fear and impatience eroded her resolve. Outside the boardroom, word of the investigation spread quickly through the building, and engineers who had spent weeks blaming themselves for the failure finally exhaled in collective, quiet relief. Several of them sought out Jessica afterwards simply to thank her, aware that her persistence had likely saved their reputations along with the company's future. Ryan was suspended from his position before the investigation even concluded, escorted from the building under the same cameras that had once captured his confident boasting. The company's stock continued to wobble, investors growing increasingly uncertain whether Harrison Aerospace could recover from a scandal layered on top of an already fragile reputation. Executives whispered among themselves about resignations, restructuring, and the very real possibility that the company might not survive the combined weight of technical failure and public dishonesty. Charlotte understood that one option remained before the board would be forced to consider shutting the project down entirely. Bringing Gabriel back was no longer simply a technical necessity, it had become the only path toward proving the company was capable of doing the right thing when it mattered most. With nothing left to lose and everything still to repair, Charlotte made the decision to go and find him herself. She arrived at Gabriel's workshop the following morning, leaving her usual entourage of assistants behind and driving herself for the first time in longer than she could remember. Gabriel looked up from beneath the same sedan he had been repairing days earlier, wiping grease from his hands as Charlotte approached without any of the polished confidence she usually carried into a room. She told him plainly that the company had wronged him, that she had allowed convenience and pressure to override a promise she had personally signed, and that there was no excuse worth offering for it. She placed a new contract on the workbench beside him, this one guaranteeing the full original payment, along with a public statement crediting him by name for saving the aircraft. Gabriel listened without interrupting, studying her face for any sign that this apology was merely strategic rather than sincere, the same way he might study a faulty gauge, looking for the small tell that revealed whether it could still be trusted. Charlotte spoke plainly about her own failures as a leader, admitting that she had spent so long managing investors and headlines that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply do right by the people who made her company function. She told him she did not expect forgiveness, only the chance to correct what could still be corrected, and she meant it in a way that surprised even her own assistants waiting outside in the car. When she finished speaking, he asked her one simple question, wanting to know whether the young engineers who had worked through sleepless nights would be protected from any further blame in the matter. Charlotte assured him they would, explaining that the investigation had already cleared the engineering team of any responsibility for the failure, placing it squarely where it belonged. Gabriel considered her words carefully, thinking less about the money on the table and more about Jessica, Connor, and the dozens of other engineers who had believed in the project even when leadership had not believed in fairness. He told Charlotte that he would return, not because the company deserved a second chance, but because the people who actually built these machines with their hands deserved one. Charlotte nodded, feeling something close to relief mixed with the quiet humility of someone who had learned a difficult lesson far later than she should have. They shook hands over the workbench, an agreement sealed not with lawyers this time, but with two people finally choosing honesty over convenience. Gabriel packed his tools once more, told his son he would be away for a few more days, and drove back toward the company that had once tried to erase him. His son asked, with the simple honesty only children seem to manage, whether the people at that company had finally learned to say thank you properly, and Gabriel laughed for the first time in weeks, telling him that they were certainly trying. When he arrived at the hangar, the engineering team gathered around him with a mixture of relief and quiet shame, aware now of everything that had happened behind closed doors. Gabriel did not dwell on blame, choosing instead to walk them through the original calibration logic step by step, explaining the delicate relationships between each sensor in language they could finally understand. He showed them precisely how Ryan's unauthorized adjustments had disrupted that balance, turning a once stable system into something unpredictable and fragile. Jessica took careful notes throughout, determined that this knowledge would never again live solely inside one man's head where it could be dismissed or undervalued. Connor watched from the cockpit doorway, arms crossed, recognizing now that the calm stranger who had once seemed unremarkable was perhaps the most capable engineer he had ever worked alongside. Hour by hour, the team rebuilt what had been broken, this time understanding exactly why each adjustment mattered. On the morning of the rescheduled demonstration, tension hung over the hangar thicker than it had during any previous attempt, since everyone understood there would be no third chance if this failed. Connor climbed into the cockpit once more, glancing back toward Gabriel standing near the open hangar doors for a small, steady nod of reassurance. The engines ignited cleanly, settling into the same confident hum that had filled the room weeks earlier, and this time nobody dared celebrate until the aircraft was safely airborne. Falcon X climbed into a clear morning sky in front of investors who had come prepared for disappointment, their skepticism dissolving into stunned silence as the jet performed flawlessly through every maneuver. From the ground, the aircraft looked almost weightless, banking and climbing with a grace that made even the most hardened skeptics in the crowd lower their phones just to watch it with their own eyes. Charlotte stood beside Jessica near the runway, her hand pressed lightly to her chest, finally allowing herself to believe that the worst of this ordeal might actually be behind them. Aaron Foster watched from the observation deck, arms folded, before finally allowing himself a slow, satisfied smile as the aircraft banked gracefully over the runway. By the time Falcon X landed, the company had not only proven the aircraft could fly, it had proven something far more important about who it had chosen to believe. Engineers who had spent weeks doubting themselves now stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the jet roll to a stop with the kind of pride that comes only after surviving something together. Connor climbed down from the cockpit and walked straight toward Gabriel, extending a hand and admitting, in front of everyone watching, that he had been wrong to ever doubt him. Jessica felt tears she had not expected rising in her eyes, not from relief alone, but from the quiet satisfaction of watching truth finally outweigh convenience inside a company she still believed in. Aaron Foster wasted no time announcing a renewed, long-term investment commitment, citing not just the aircraft's performance but the company's willingness to admit and correct its own mistakes. Charlotte stood before the assembled investors and reporters and did something Ryan had refused to do months earlier, crediting Gabriel Carter by name as the engineer who had truly saved Falcon X. Cameras that had once captured Ryan's boastful claims now captured Gabriel standing quietly to the side, uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to disappear before the truth had been spoken aloud. Reporters who approached him afterward found a man far more interested in discussing sensor calibration than personal recognition, deflecting most questions back toward the team that had rebuilt the aircraft alongside him. Jessica stood nearby, watching the moment unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the credit finally rested where it had always belonged. For the first time in 3 years, the company's future felt steady rather than borrowed against tomorrow's uncertainty. In the weeks that followed, Ryan was formally terminated from the company, his departure accompanied by a brief statement that mentioned conduct unbecoming of his position without elaborating further. Harrison Aerospace underwent a quiet but thorough restructuring, introducing new oversight measures designed to ensure no single executive could again override safety-critical decisions for the sake of personal credit. Gabriel received every dollar originally promised to him, deposited without delay or argument, along with a formal written apology signed by Charlotte herself. The company offered him a senior advisory position with significant authority over future engineering decisions, a role that came with considerable salary and influence within the organization. Gabriel declined the title, explaining that he had no interest in boardrooms, budgets, or managing other people's careers, however generous the offer might be. Instead, he accepted a narrower role as an independent technical consultant, free to choose his projects and free to return home to his son every evening without obligation. He negotiated only one additional condition into the new arrangement, insisting that any future contracts signed at Harrison Aerospace include clear, binding language protecting whoever did the work from ever again losing credit to whoever simply talked the loudest. Charlotte carried the experience with her long after the cameras stopped following the story, reflecting often on how close the company had come to losing everything over a decision rooted in convenience rather than character. She began making it a habit, in every major decision afterward, to ask not simply whether something was profitable, but whether it was something she could explain honestly to the people it affected most. Falcon X became more than a successful aircraft, evolving into a quiet symbol within the company of what honesty could rebuild after greed had nearly destroyed it. Industry publications eventually told the story themselves, describing Gabriel as the man who had saved a $40 million jet, and in doing so had saved a company from the worst version of itself. A few journalists tried to dig further into his past, hoping to uncover some dramatic military story behind his skill, but Gabriel declined every interview request with the same polite, immovable patience he had shown the entire time he worked at Harrison Aerospace. Jessica stayed in touch with him long after the story faded from headlines, occasionally sending photographs of new prototypes for his opinion, which he always gave honestly and without flattery. Connor, too, became an unlikely friend, stopping by the workshop on weekends just to talk about engines and to remind Gabriel that some lessons were worth more than any contract could measure. Gabriel read very little of that coverage, preferring instead to spend his evenings teaching his son how an engine actually worked, one bolt at a time. His reputation, once nearly forgotten, returned to him not through headlines or applause, but through the simple, undeniable proof of his own integrity and skill, exactly the way he would have wanted it.